Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks so much for joining us today on our forum on regulatory and policy reform surrounding rare disease treatments. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Alexian Pharmaceuticals, for supporting today's event on what is World Rare Disease Day. Scientific advances are making new treatments possible for some of the more than 7,000 rare diseases that currently impact 1 in 10 Americans. But some advocates say current regulatory measures are holding back further progress, and there's a lack of engagement with rare disease patients and experts. Efforts to change the status quo are taking shape on Capitol Hill. Legislation introduced in Congress is looking to improve protocols for rare diseases therapies, drug review processes, and patient access to treatment. We have an exciting lineup of speakers joining me for a deep dive into regulatory reforms and policy implications for the 30 million Americans living with rare diseases. But before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag The Hill Rare Diseases. I know that's a lot of letters, but The Hill Rare Diseases. We're broadcasting live and we'll take your questions throughout the program. As with any live stream, you could experience occasional trouble with the video. Refreshing the page would probably fix the problem, and I hope it does for you. My first guest is Dr. Janet Woodcock, Principal Deputy Commissioner at the Food and Drug Administration, or short, the FDA. She has championed patient-focused drug development and the importance of investment and innovation in tackling rare diseases. For the past 13 months, Dr. Janet Woodcock served as the acting FDA Commissioner. We're delighted to have you joining us again. You always accept our invitations to come help educate us on what's happening in this world of a lot of diseases, viruses, public health, and how to get it right. But let me just ask you, I think one of the questions when it comes to rare disease, and this is going to not be a pharmacological one, 1 in 10 Americans have rare diseases. And I don't think that's something that's broadly understood or known. How do we turn this, from your perspective, to being a topic and discussion that comes up when we're doing rare disease on World Rare Disease Day, and something that's more ever present as we think about how we become healthier and smarter as a country on drugs and rare diseases?
Well, I think it needs to get into the public discourse. People with rare diseases need to speak up. They need to be featured. They need to be on talk shows. Everyone understands, common cancers, heart disease, the major killers, diabetes, and so forth. They don't realize how much suffering is going on. Often people they know or know of from a rare disease that is much less well understood.
One of, I'm sure, an acquaintance of yours, probably a friend, Dr. Francis Collins, who's stepping down at NIH, has said that because of COVID, and COVID in very unexpected ways, because patients weren't signing up for clinical trials or clinical sites were closing, that we probably lost about $10 billion of combined impact on the research agenda, which is, slows progress in a lot of ways. And I'm just wondering what your perspective is and whether that ecosystem somehow needs to be addressed, propped up, given more time, whether it's exclusivity in some of this. Is there anything that needs to be adjusted so that we can catch up with ourselves again?
Well, in general, I think the clinical trial ecosystem needs a lot of work, and I've been pretty outspoken about that over time. We need more support. It needs to be easier to do trials and get that evaluation done, because not only has money been lost, but the ability to improve people's lives has been delayed because these trials have been delayed. Our understanding hasn't advanced as fast as it could. So I really believe COVID has given us some new tools. We understand how to do telemedicine in clinical trials better now. We can do them more efficiently, more IT enabled. But really, we do need to get clinical research out into the community so that we can have more Americans actually be able to participate.
I've spent a lot of time in the last few weeks talking to companies in this world, patients that are in this world, researchers, and I think there is a concern. Well, and the FDA has been given praise for trying to find more nimble ways to work with telehealth, to find different ways to sort of come in and to receive praise there. But there's a feeling that maybe structurally some other reforms could be achieved. One of the ones that has come up in discussion is the Helping Experts Accelerate Rare Treatments Act, the HEART Act. looking at how to build in rare disease experts into the process. Have you thought about some of those structural enhancements that might bring voice of patients, doctors, others from the rare disease world into the process?
We would really like to do these things. As you know, the FDA is pretty resource constrained, and between approving 1,000 generic drugs a year and dealing with all the innovations and all the challenges they bring, such as gene therapy and cellular therapy and so forth, and all the other work that we have to do, like with COVID, it's hard. Our resources are stretched. So we think, and I understand the Center for Drugs, the Center for Biologics are really thinking hard about ways in which they can improve and assist innovation in the rare disease space. And a lot of that, as you said, is providing more help and assistance, expert advice and input into the development process.
You know, I think one of the other things, again, I'm a neophyte in this arena, and I just find it, fascinating when you talk. I talked to a patient who has Lamb disease, and in early on, she actually helped to raise the money for a $15,000 study to kind of get qualified and do a report to go out and get a grant. And it's fascinating to sort of look at how those people who find themselves in a community can now, with technology, reach out to others and kind of bring them along. But I know you're on the pharmacological side of this and the approval and oversight, and you're worried about public health. I want to talk to Janet Woodcock, the human being who would give advice to people who all of a sudden find that they're in one of these communities, and it's not a big one. Tell us a little bit about your thinking about what folks can do on the human side of this as they deal with, I guess, the loneliness, the stigma, the resource issues. What are some of the elements you see that are important?
Well, we've provided support for this to NORD, to the Critical Path Institute and others, because now social media, the internet provide tremendous new opportunities for people to get together worldwide in a community, no matter how small their disease is, and actually have influence in how their disease is evaluated, how it's conceived of, and what treatments might be used. And many disease groups now are doing, for example, natural history studies, so that for their rare disease, we can figure out what happens to people. How does the disease unfold over time? And it's meaningful because then you're making a difference. And some diseases, as you know, there have been what we call venture philanthropy, or in fact, the people with the disease and their advocacy organization have taken matters into their own hands, and they have raised money and they have sponsored trials. And in some cases that has been successful in bringing advances in that disease.
One of the other features of this, I guess, there's seven, as I understand it, 7,000 rare diseases we know. I've talked to folks that have, looked at a study of about 360 of these, so a small portion that cover about 15 million Americans. But a lot of the therapies that are brought on aren't FDA approved. And I guess my question is, what is the gap there between FDA approval and the actual use in a community? How can that be a constructive bridge rather than a destructive one?
Yeah, well, I have advocated that people put up what we call platform trials or master protocols, where the goal of the protocol is to figure out what improves the disease and keep improving outcomes in the disease over time. And that would mean that repurposed drugs, in other words, those drugs that are typically used off-label to try and help people with the disease, could be put into the protocol, and you could see whether or not they were helpful. And if you generate such data, then you can get FDA approval. Part of the problem is because the diseases are rare, people are scattered all over. It's been hard to run these protocols, gather up enough people, to be in a trial and then evaluate the outcomes. But now the internet and all the other abilities we have for connectivity really enable new ways of doing this. And we really need to find out what improves the disease outcomes. And we need to improve that over time until we get to a cure.
So, whenever I'm interviewing someone, I try to put myself in their shoes. And so what I know, on one hand, I've done a lot of these events and programs over the years. There's a lot of expectation among those who are in particular need, and there are support groups of saying, why can't this process go faster? Why can't we get clinical trials done faster and cheaper and get to outcomes more quickly? I know the other side of it is that sometimes things fail. Clinical trials fail. I've told the drug industry it would be good for Americans to know more about your failures, that not everything is a slam dunk. I guess my question to you, and maybe it's unfair, and we've seen mistakes in the past like opioids, et cetera, but how do you get the public equity right while also meeting the expectation that we're moving as expeditiously we can on drug approval? So, this is why I feel like you're kind of in a no-win situation on both sides. But how? What's the North Star in that? And what do you want to say to the rare disease community that I think is listening to this about how you can both be expeditious and safe?
Well, I don't think it's an either or. I do think there are better ways to do things. One of the reasons interventions fail, is that the disease is so heterogeneous. And so we don't actually know what happens to people. And so we study the wrong thing, for example. So we've really encouraged and supported what are called natural history studies to figure out what actually happens to people over time who have a rare disease. But the second thing is people don't want drugs that don't work, because every drug has some toll that takes, some liability, some harm it causes. So we want to evaluate drugs and see if they work. I think part of the problem for people with rare diseases or with children with rare diseases, they're desperate because there's nothing out there. And so when there's nothing, your theory is, well, something is better than nothing. That isn't always the case. A harmful something isn't better. So it's really important to find out whether they help or not. That said, the trial shouldn't take forever. We should have cohorts ready to get entered. We should simplify our trials. We should do this as fast as possible. And there are ways to do this now if we put our minds to it.
Let me ask you another unfair question. I just reread a book that was very powerful, Promises to Keep, by President Biden, about his experience with his son, Beau. And in there, there's stories where they were taking pictures of medical records from one cancer center and FaceTiming it, showing it to the medical records down at the MD Anderson Cancer Center. And it's just one of these things where I wonder, as we're thinking about how to do smart health in this country, do drug development, connect to people where they are, have personalized medicine, whether there are parts of the health ecosystem infrastructure we ignore and aren't. And my understanding is that the health records dimension of this is one almost never discussed, but it's like tragically bad. That's what I'm told. Are there other parts of the ecosystem that aren't under FDA control, aren't at part of the companies, that if we actually remedied the passage of information that's HIPAA compliant, but began to address that it would enhance our ability to do research faster?
Absolutely. Figure you identify a patient with a rare disease, but they're at some rural site or they live somewhere where they don't have access to clinical trials. Well, that's an opportunity lost. And when you don't have very many patients, you need every opportunity you can get. And to learn from health experiences or even these off-label uses you were talking about, you need valid data from the health records. And we can't get that right now, unfortunately, the way we'd like. There are efforts going on. FDA is collaborating with people who are trying to improve those records to the extent we could use them. And instead of having separate case report forms that clinicians have to enter separately all the outcomes information in and so forth, we could simplify things a great deal if we had better interoperability and somewhat better standardization.
Well, let me just ask you finally, Dr. Woodcock, I'm sure we're going to have a lot of folks from the rare disease community watching today's show, not just today. I think this is the kind of show that has shelf life, that as people find it. So I guess my question to you is an open-ended one. What would you like this community to best know about what your priorities in the rare disease space are that I might not have asked or been aware of?
Well, our priorities is that we work together to make this situation better, that we get all the information we can on the disease, natural history studies, valid information we can use, that we get the right outcome measures, and we need patient input into that. How do you experience the disease? What do you want to have improved about this disease? How can we measure that? Those things all are preparatory to actually testing an intervention. So there's work that goes on that enables and de-risks people developing different interventions for your rare disease. And my message is patients can make a difference, and they have and they will. And we hope that we see more of that going forward, that we all work together toward better outcomes.
Very much appreciate that message and you taking time today. I know how busy you are for sharing that with us. Dr. Janet Woodcock, Principal Deputy Commissioner at the Food and Drug Administration, thanks so much as always for joining us.
Great talking to you.
Our first panel of the day takes a deep dive into what researchers would like to see from the FDA in terms of regulatory and policy changes. Mark Skinner is President and CEO of the Institute for Policy Advancement, a global health strategies consulting company. He's also an assistant professor at McMaster University. It's great to have him with us. And Dr. Wen-Han Tan is an attending physician in the Division of Genetics and Genomics at Boston Children's Hospital and an associate professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. Welcome to you both. Dr. Tan, let me start with you. My understanding is you're one of the rare people who have dived deeply into the rare disease space and have kind of approached the rare disease arena, many parts of it. And when my team talked to you about what you had heard from patients, what you've been informed from your experience about tweaks in the way we do research and respond and do therapies, they came out with something I think would make a great book. I mean, you have a lot of critiques of the system and would love to give our audience an understanding of the parts of this process that you think we could really begin to remedy in different ways.
Thank you, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about this really important topic today. So I think what we really need in the rare disease world is legislation that would really compel the FDA to engage actively with patient support groups, as well as the key opinion leaders in the field in their drug approval process. So it's very heartening to hear from Dr. Woodcock that she would like patients to be more involved. Our experience, certainly in the Angelman syndrome world that I've been involved in, is that very often what happens is that drug companies would go to the FDA, present a proposal for a clinical trial as part of their pre-IND meeting, and then they are told by the FDA to perform certain procedures or to design their trial in a certain way that perhaps they may not have thought of doing or may not have wanted to do, but felt compelled to do so because the FDA told them to do that. And when they come back to see us, we say, well, that really doesn't work for this disorder, for this community. I think what would be really helpful is for the rare disease community, both patients and clinicians who manage and treat these patients, to be involved in the discussion with the FDA and the drug company upfront, so that when they come up with suggestions for changes to their protocol, modifications of protocol, they can have input from the rare disease community. The other thing that Dr. Woodcock had brought up is the use of natural history data. And that is a really important point. And unfortunately, the FDA seems to have been very reluctant to actually use data from natural history studies conducted by academic investigators as part of the drug approval process. So we have been running a natural history study in Angelman syndrome since 2006. So this is coming up to 16 years now. And we are hearing from some drug companies that the FDA is skeptical of our data, even though our study was initially funded by the NIH and currently actually funded by the FDA itself. And yet people are telling us that, well, companies have to conduct their own natural history studies because they don't trust or can't use the data that we have generated in a highly rigorous study. So I think that I think what Dr. Woodcock has sort of said in her interview is great, except that there seems to be a disconnect between what she's exposing and what is actually happening at the level of the review divisions.
That is, a fascinating comment. And when I heard Dr. Woodcock make the comment, I wondered to what degree, the staff and teams of the FDA reflected that. Mark Skinner, I know that you've been very outspoken as well on how you see the relationship between research and, I think you've got this great line, of how do we move patient anecdotes to evidence? Would love to get, your take on how, again, I try to put it to Dr. Woodcock. I know there's lots of pressure to get to clinical endpoints and get the process moved along. And you wonder where that balance with public safety and therapeutic responses is, and would love to get your thoughts on it. And we can come back to Dr. Tan.
Yes, and thank you. Thank you for having me on today. So just one brief addition to my introduction. I am an individual. I live with severe hemophilia. I come from the rare disease world and have a lifetime of experience working both nationally and globally in the hemophilia and blood disorders space. So, so my comments come from a perspective of experience as well as aspiration. The safest, most effective drugs that aren't available to patients are of no use to us. So what are the missing links that will help us bring drugs to market? Too often we have found that the clinical development, the drug development pipeline is siloed, that companies think about what's required to get the FDA or the EMA approval, and then they think about what's required to either pass a technology assessment or to get market access, and then even the third bucket, what information is needed for patients and clinicians to make a decision. And so patients really need to be at the table throughout that whole process. I guess my aspiration is for the FDA to perhaps take a little bit heavier hand in making sure that the companies, when they're in their early development work, truly have sat down and engaged with patients and understand what would make a difference in your life. What are really the outcomes that we're looking for, and that the clinical trials will be designed around those and collect the data. Too often we look at some of the narrow elements of bringing a drug to market, but it doesn't really answer the question that's important. And if that data is not available, then it's going to be very difficult to persuade payers to pay for that data and for patients to understand it. So while it's great to be supportive of natural history studies and to talk the talk, the concepts of patient-focused drug development have been around for a while, but it's somewhat of a chicken and egg. The companies don't collect it, they don't report it, and it's not out in a timely way. So unless we are rewarding and acknowledging and really pursuing the companies making those decisions and those engagements early on, we're not going to be able to move forward. And as I've reflected, I really think the FDA is the linchpin here that can really drive this forward.
So, Mark, before I jump back to Dr. Tan, I just want to understand, are you saying that right now, say we have an X-rare disease, a relatively small community in the United States, I want to remind everybody, rare diseases are 1 in 10 Americans in this country, so it is much more prevalent than is often discussed. But in the process of this, you want the FDA to meet with those researchers, meet with patients to begin, laying out a track for what they would hope to generate, as opposed to more hands-off. Am I getting that right, Mark? And I apologize, I'm a layperson in this, so if I'm saying it badly, I apologize.
Well, and I'm a layperson too. My expertise comes from a lifetime of lived experience, and I'm trained as a lawyer, not as a clinician or a researcher. But I want the FDA to hold the companies accountable when they come in with their primary, their secondary, their exploratory endpoints for their trials to say, how did you come up with these? Were patients involved? Or these are outcomes that would make a difference in the life of a patient? And to be able to demonstrate that early on. And I think if the FDA is asking those questions consistently and holding the companies accountable to be able to demonstrate that, in fact, the drug they're developing is designed around patient centricity, I think we'll come a long way in moving forward. And that will help us downstream when we work on market access and patient-clinician shared decision-making in the clinical setting.
Dr. Tan, I'd love to get any of your reactions to what Mark Skinner is suggesting by way of an early step in the process, and thoughts on natural history data that's generated. But I want to ask you something else, because we've just come through. Well, I actually hate those words. We are not yet through COVID, but we're experiencing COVID. And as I've done various events in the health space, it's just very clear to me that COVID has disrupted research, has disrupted clinical trials. I've heard with Francis Collins recently talking about, he estimates a $10 billion hit to research programs, the collapse of clinical sites to actually go get data. And so there's been some credit given to the FDA that in some places they've allowed telehealth and other forms of data collection. But I'm just wondering, as you comment on Mark's comments, but can you share with us, how far have we been set back because of COVID in the rare disease research space?
Thank you. So these are really important questions. So first of all, I would say I totally echo what Mark has just said. I think everything that he has said, I would fully support. I will also say that we want to engage with the FDA. I see the FDA as our friend, not as an adversary. I want to work with the FDA to make this program and this process much smoother, much better for our patients, right? So we need the FDA on our side, and we need to engage with the FDA. Now, coming to your point about COVID for a minute. So yes, COVID has been very disruptive for clinical drug development, for clinical trials. I've personally been involved in 2 clinical trials throughout this COVID era. And what I think we have learned is that while on one hand, it has been disruptive in that we had not been able to bring patients in person for visits, it has actually forced us to use technology that we had not previously thought about. So for example, remote visits. So as an example, in pre-COVID, we used to have study visits that were several hours long, which actually were quite burdensome for patients. But because of COVID, we were able to pivot, and were forced indeed to pivot into a mixture of in-person and telemedicine visits. And what that has done is to greatly reduce the burden on patient participation. And it actually has made trials, in some ways, almost paradoxically, more accessible to patients, because they no longer have to travel to individual sites and spend many, many hours. We can do this remotely. So I think COVID has both been a curse and a blessing in some ways. Certainly more a curse than a blessing for many of us who were affected by it personally. But it really has allowed us to tap into technology that we may not otherwise have thought of using. I do think that coming back to use of natural history studies, so absolutely big fan of it. I'm obviously biased and prejudiced, having been the PI of a large-scale natural history study for many years. What I think we really need is to have patients be part of this process way back at the beginning of the development process. So as you probably know, the FDA actually holds public meetings when the drugs are being considered for approval. So these are when the companies are presenting their clinical trial data, when they're hoping to seek approval for their drugs in process. And they have public meetings to decide, and patients can have a voice and help perhaps sway the committees to approve this drug. Now, what I would say is that engagement with patients need to start much, much earlier. Not right at the end when the drugs are up for consideration of approval, but before the clinical trial has even been launched. And I think what we really need is legislature to force the FDA to actually engage with patients, right? So before you can approve an IND, you need to have input from the patient community and from the clinicians who take care of these patients, from the key opinion leaders, to say, is this feasible? Is this likely to be a good outcome? Is there, for example, a need to use placebo? Is this a kind of placebo that is most appropriate for this population? Right? So there are a lot of questions that only the patients who are living the disease, who are in the trenches, and the clinicians who are dealing with these patients every day can really help the FDA answer.
That's terrific. Dr. Skinner, you are living this life, and you have been in the rare disease space for a long time. And I will tell the audience, it's a fascinating world. I've met real heroes in my research. We have a person with lived experience who is joining our program shortly. We have later in our program Kelly Maynard, who's founder of the Little Hercules Foundation, who's actually part of the state of Ohio Rare Disease Advisory Council. So structurally, I think one of my beefs with this is why don't we know a lot more about it? Why don't we discuss this a lot more? Why are we waiting for World Rare Disease Day to do this, honestly? And so I guess my question to you on the FDA side, and maybe other reforms you think are important, is that I know that some in the rare disease community are hoping the FDA begins to build in advisory councils of experts so that at various stages in the process, both in terms of, if the drugs are being communicated, but there are rare disease advisory councils that are built in, that there are patient-oriented discussions that are built in. So it's less ad hoc, less when one wants to, and more a part of the playbook, if you will. I was surprised by Dr. Woodcock's openness to some of this, and would love to get your sense of specifically what would be some of the elements of FDA reform or social and structural research reform that you think are important that we know about.
I think that's a great lead in, and there is experience for this. I mean, the concepts of health equity really mean that we all need to be included, and we need to be mindful of the diversity of the patient populations and those that have been underserved. Within the blood world where I come from, largely arising out of the HIV crisis of the 80s, several federal advisory committees were created that included patients at the FDA and at HHS. I've had a privilege to serve on many of them for many years, and those have been really highly effective in ensuring that the patient voice is there, that patients are sitting down with the regulators, the decision makers, but they don't really speak to clinical trial design. So I would love to see more early on. I think it can come from the FDA, can also come from industry. I've had the privilege to serve on data safety monitoring boards, to participate in clinical trial development programs where you actually ask the patients, what's the burden of this trial? I think we have a lot of experience as patients coming out of COVID, what can be done remotely and what can be done in person. And we will be very insightful that actually will help the clinical development process. The burdens of going into the lab to fill out just patient-reported outcome forms when those can be done electronically, or monitoring visits, or doing local lab draws, whatever the nature of it may be, patients can help the efficiency of clinical trial development. Patients can make sure that the outcomes are right. And if the FDA has an open process that companies can come to, I think it really will complete that winning coalition. Clearly, Dr. Tan and I are aligned as patients and clinicians, and that certainly is the work that many organizations like NORD, which I have the privilege to serve on the board of as well, are focused on. But having the FDA as one of our key partners and industry, and all of us rowing together and understanding the importance of early engagement, I think is the key. And if it takes the regulatory or legislative tools to make that happen, I would be fully supportive.
Well, listen, I want to thank you. I've been thinking to myself about today's program, not just because of World Rare Diseases Day, but in 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, when people come back, they Google, they say, oh, I'd like to learn something, experiencing something that I don't know much about. Will these kind of discussions help? I think they will. I think people will hear you both. Dr. Wenhan Tan, attending physician, Division of Genetics and Genomics at Boston Children's Hospital and Associate Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. Mark Skinner, President CEO of the Institute for Policy Studies, an assistant professor as well at McMaster University, and as he said, an individual living the life of rare disease. Thank you both so much for joining us today. Really grateful.
Thank you.
And now a message from our sponsor, Alexian Pharmaceuticals. Please welcome Del LaBelle, Head of U.S. Government Affairs at Policy at Alexian, AstraZeneca Rare Disease. He is in conversation with Mike Page, Vice President, Global Regulatory Affairs, Development Strategy at Alexian, AstraZeneca Rare Disease. Del, over to you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Del LaBelle, and I'm the head of the U.S. Government Affairs and Policy at Alexian. And on this Rare Disease Day, we are reminded of the reason we are here today. 95% of rare diseases do not have an approved treatment option. But rare diseases aren't so rare, as collectively 30 million Americans, roughly 10% of the country, are living with rare disease. And I'm pleased to be joined today by my colleague, Mike Page, who leads our Global Regulatory Affairs Development Strategy team at Alexian. And today, we will discuss a pivotal role that rare disease research and development plays in finding new medicines for patients with rare and devastating diseases, as well as how regulations and other public policies contribute to developing these life-saving medicines. Mike, thanks for joining us. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Dale. As you say, my name's Mike Page. I'm the head of development strategy in the Global Regulatory Affairs Organization at Alexion. Our primary role is to advise teams on how to develop products in rare diseases in such a way that they have the maximum opportunity, maximum chance of approval with product information, prescribing information, which describes effective use of the product in the safe way.
Interesting. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate that overview. And the complexity to the regulatory process more generally for drugs is quite complex. Wondering if you can expand on the circumstances that make rare disease drug development unique from a regulatory perspective, because I don't think people necessarily contemplate that or have the fullest appreciation for some of the unique challenges or differences from a regulatory standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the most obvious issue that we deal with in rare diseases is the rarity of the disease, if you like. We have a relatively small pool of patients which we could enroll into clinical trials. But at the same time, we are still required, quite rightly, to provide evidence that supports efficacy and safety of the product, as we would for any other program. So what that means is that we have to be extremely efficient in the way that we run our studies. Every single patient really counts, because we don't have the luxury of having large clinical trials. So really, we have to focus very, very carefully on recruiting and retaining patients in our studies. In fact, we've got several instances where one or two patients the effect of one or two individual patients can have a huge impact on the overall outcome of the study.
Such an important point. I think when you think about the future of regulation, what's coming, what can we expect in the coming months on the regulatory front?
That was the most immediate, I think, impact that we're expecting, particularly here in the US, is the ongoing discussions around reauthorization of the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, PDUFA 7, which is kind of in discussion with Congress at the moment. So PDUFA 6, the previous version, had a big component of development around rare diseases, particularly around the concept of the use of real-world evidence. I think everybody's aware of that. We use real-world evidence a lot at Alexion. We rely very much on the use of registries and the use of natural history data in the way that we design and run our studies. We've used registry data to provide information on safe use of our products in pregnancy, for example. So, we definitely commend the FDA on advancing the use of real-world evidence. There's been some recent guidelines which have been issued, and we're very happy to be able to work with the agency around that. PDUFA 7, again, there's a real emphasis, I think, on rare disease medicine development. The Rare Disease Endpoint Advancement Program is a pilot program which will be focused on developing new endpoints. So we'll be able to work with the FDA on bringing new endpoints forward. That's something that we have to do in almost all of our development programs. You know, a lot of the areas where we work, you know, there aren't endpoints which are there aren't clinical endpoints which we can use kind of off the shelf. We have to design those. So we have to work, and it's very good for us to be able to work with the FDA on developing those. And I think the concept of like enhanced communication between sponsors and the FDA throughout development is something that we definitely welcome. I think one of the good things about working in rare diseases is that we have interesting programs in interesting new diseases. Generally speaking, regulators are interested in the things that we do, so that we have a good relationship with the review divisions that we work with. So the fact that is, I guess that's become part of the PDUFA 7 discussion, I think is, you know, encouraging to us, and we really look forward to working with FDA as we advance, you know, the availability of new medicines for rare diseases.
So, speaking in part of partnering with the FDA, we're seeing a lot of proposed policies applying components and learnings from existing centers of excellence at the FDA to rare disease, to both increase coordination at the FDA and ensure the rare disease patient voice is represented. For example, the Speeding Therapy Access Today STAT Act, as we know it, would essentially require an FDA Institute on Rare Diseases and Conditions to help internal coordination on rare disease product review, share expertise, and facilitate collaboration with other health agencies. Essentially, it would serve as the engagement office for rare disease stakeholders to implement cross-center rare disease policy development and coordinate rare disease regulatory science activities. From your perspective, Mike, what is your perspective on these types of regulatory reforms? You know, would a rare disease center of excellence or implementation of some COE components help speed access to rare disease medicines?
I think it's fair to say that increasing the level of discussion around rare diseases at the FDA is something that we would definitely support. I think engaging stakeholders in rare diseases, particularly patients and patient groups, I think is something that the FDA has something of a good track record on. And I think enhancing that and institutionalizing that within the agency is something that I think would be kind of beneficial to everybody who's involved in bringing forward new therapies in these areas of medical need. So I think that just the fact that we're talking about rare diseases in the context of regulatory improvements around general regulatory initiatives is definitely something that we welcome. Yeah,
thanks. I appreciate that perspective. Great, Mike. Very insightful. Thanks for your remarks. Are there any other programs in the oncology space that would be beneficial to the patient community?
I mean, I think that I think it's well established that the implementation of the Oncology Center of Excellence has been a huge advance in oncology development. So I think that having a similar approach could certainly bring similar benefits in the rare disease world. Well, I think one in particular, the real-time oncology review, which has been a pilot program in the Oncology Center of Excellence, seems to have been very useful in advancing or in accelerating the review and increasing the collaboration in review for oncology products. I think PDUFA 7 has got that split real-time review proposal, which goes beyond oncology. And I think that potentially could be of benefit to us.
Great. Thanks, Mike. As you're aware, the Biden administration and congressional members have been focused on increasing clinical trial diversity through legislative and regulatory proposals. This is something that Alexian is committed to, clinical trial diversity. Can you talk about specific ways that Alexian is trying to recruit more diverse patient populations?
I mean, there's certainly a lot of interesting developments to enhance the overall reach in terms of communities who aren't well served by clinical trials. One particular, I think digital remote monitoring is something that we're looking at in terms of using new tools and technologies to access patients and give patients access to our clinical trials, more importantly, that minimizes the burden allows us to assess and report data remotely. That's something that is early stage, but we're looking at. But I think overall, I think one of the key factors that we take into account at Alexion is really aligning our clinical trials as effectively as we can to align to the communities who are affected by the diseases where we operate. So I think interacting directly, with patient advocacy stakeholders allows us to do that and actually have clinical trial populations which best represent the communities, those disease communities.
Great. That's really fantastic. And thank you, Mike. And on behalf of Alexion, thank you for letting us share our perspective today. It's critical to continue the discussion among stakeholder communities, as it really will help inform policy recommendations going forward. And Alexion, collectively, we hope to work with the rare disease community to further refine public policy recommendations around accelerating access to rare disease therapies in the coming weeks. Thank you again.
Thank you, Del LaBelle and Mike Page. And Del, I really like your backdrop there. I'd love to learn how you got that and use it myself. Our next panel looks at the need for patient engagement and health equity. Dr. Frank McCormick is professor of internal medicine at the University of Cincinnati School of Medicine. Kelly Maynard is founder of the Little Hercules Foundation. You heard me mention it earlier. She launched the foundation after her youngest son was diagnosed with the rare disease Duchenne muscular dystrophy at the age of 5. And Dr. Frida Lewis Hall is a patient health equity advocacy and a former chief medical officer at Pfizer. I always love talking to Frida. Frida, it's great seeing you again and having you here. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let me just start with Dr. McCormick. We're going to be interviewing, I've already had the conversation actually, but I have a conversation in a while with Sarah Bacon. And Sarah is a person who suffers with Lamb disease. It's a rare disease. And Dr. McCormick, I know that you have put much of your life into this community of rare disease. And I'd love to know from you and have have our viewers listen to you, as someone who's been a practitioner, a researcher, offered therapies in this area, headed the foundation. What's gone well in dealing with this segment of rare disease? What isn't going well?
Thank you very much for inviting me. I have been involved with the foundation since 1995, and this community of patients came together under the direction of a mother whose daughter was diagnosed with Lamb about that time, and she was able to gather the trust of hundreds of patients with the disease that ended up supporting some early research that provided the foundation for clinical trials and ultimately led to an approved therapy for Lamb over the course of about 20 years. And I'd say the things that have gone well are that patient engagement drove the whole process. We had great help from many directions, including pharma and from the FDA and from physician scientists around the world. And ultimately, the key to finding a treatment was patients who are willing to enroll in trials and take risk. At the time that it became obvious that this drug had great promise in Lamb, any one of these patients could have gone to their own physicians, gotten a prescription written, and taken the drug off label. But I think the community realized the benefit of proving for all time that this drug was going to be useful in Lamb really carried the day. And in the end, these patients signed up for 2 years of being randomized to either a placebo or a drug, not knowing which they're receiving, while their lung function declined at the rate of about 10% per year. So in the end, it's tremendous courage on the parts of patients that really made this happen.
And before I jump to our other guests, Dr. McCormick, I guess the question I have is, that had been my experience too. I would sort of meet these heroes, who've moved forward research, who've helped raise money, who've kind of, I've used this a couple times, Horton Hears a Who. It's like, we're here, and we matter. But I'm just interested in how we move beyond the need for people to be, I'm going to get this wrong. I love heroes, but should we be depending on heroism of patients to do this? What are the structural deficits in our research and approach to rare diseases that, from your insights, you think we have an opportunity to fix?
Well, there's a lot of innovation in trial design that might obviate the need for randomized clinical trials in some situations, but it's very hard to improve upon randomized clinical trials for proving that a therapy works. And it's just a hard fact of life. And it ends up, I think, falling to the patients to sort of get the courage and enroll in these studies to prove that these therapies work. My hope is in the future there'll be ways to do this without having to randomize patients to a therapy or a placebo, but I don't know a way forward at this point.
Well, thank you. Well, Kelly Maynard, I mentioned you earlier as part of what I saw as a very positive element of, that there's infrastructure. I had no idea that there was a rare disease advisory council to the governor of Ohio. That's terrific, right? And you're a member of that. Your life changed with your son's diagnosis. I read a bit of your story. And I guess I've always had this, insecurity in talking about this to a certain degree when I hear that people who are suffering from something, they become the champions, just like Dr. McCormick said. They get involved and raise the money. So there are people like me who want to be allies. How best to be an ally? How best to bring other people along so it's not just family members of your son that are moving forward, it's other members of the community. Is that a fair question?
That absolutely is, and thank you for having me, and thank you for asking the question. I think there are many ways to support rare disease patients and organizations. First, one critical step towards getting approved treatments is making sure that we have organized and robust advocacy representation. And so that's critically important. We have to know how to get to patients, regardless if the disease affects 20,000 patients, 100,000 patients, or 100 patients. So that's step number one. Donating money is, moms like us are constantly raising money. And so that's a great way to, propel the science forward. We have, many of the treatments that are in the development pipeline and are approved started because we funded that, we gave seed funding to these really smart researchers that were wanting to develop a cure. And we were able to de-risk that so companies could come in and commercialize those treatments. And now we have 4 approved treatments to treat Duchenne that are mutation specific. So they treat about 31% of our disease population, and that we just saw our first approval in 2016. So it definitely works.
Wow. I just last week I interviewed a woman, also a mom, who has a son with 2 genetic disorders, and one is the Prader-Willi syndrome. And I just asked her, I said, can you share with someone who's sort of taken such an active role structurally with this rare disease, what's your life? And she would say they were constantly traveling because of having to see certain specialists, and completely disrupted their lives. And so I guess a question I would love our audience to know is, can you convey to our audience what it is like to be the support network of someone who's suffering from rare disease?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all can relate. You've heard several times today, there are over 7,000 rare diseases, the large majority of which are genetic in nature, and affect about 1 in 10 of us in America. So we have all those diseases are very different and varied. The common thing that we have is that, we're all fighting the time clock, right? And we've been doing it since diagnosis day. And so there are a lot of similarities in our lives. And I've had moms say to me, and dads, they take 1 day a week to just complete phone calls and call in prescription refills. 1 whole day a week is just made, is set aside to coordinate care on behalf of their loved one. I think we can do better with caregiver support in this country. And COVID has shined a bright light on that, right? For those living with rare diseases that are disabling in nature and require home health aids. We lost all of that help during COVID. And so we had to basically become skilled nurses on top of everything else, and taking care of our other children and working. And so I would love to see us improve caregiver support and improve efforts for rare disease patients who are traveling across state lines. We can do better with coverage, with Medicaid coverage and coordinating Medicaid coverage. So there are lots of ways that we can do that, but we just have to make it a priority. It has to be important.
Frida Lewis Hall, I remember we spoke, I think it was last year, and the big thing going on then was COVID vaccine trials and the questions of inclusivity, reaching broad communities all around. I can't imagine a more important topic as well to discuss than inclusivity in trials, but really inclusion and diversity in research in the rare disease space, which throws in a layer of complexity and challenge. But would love to get your thought on how do we not gasp for air so much on this? How can we become more confident that baked in? And I got to tell people, from my understanding, it's not, particularly in this space, thinking of the Little Hercules Foundation, it's not just, ethnic diversity, it's also age diversity. And I'm just surprised at how undiverse a lot of our trials are. But Frida, I'm sorry to be giving your shtick, but you taught me a little bit. But give us your thoughts.
Well, you're doing a great job there. Thank you so much for getting us started in such a robust way. But you're absolutely right. The intersection between underserved communities, whether it be age, the level of advancement of a disease, for example, geography, there are a whole host of things that create a lack of diversity in the clinical trial environment. And we can and must do a better job at that. And there are a number of points that were made earlier that I think are really important. The first is identifying those specific issues. Are there actually differences for communities that are underserved currently and need to be included that add the additional barriers? For example, access to care. If getting diagnosed properly with a rare disease is difficult, imagine being someone who is a minority who may not have access to general care, but in particular may not have access to specific specialized care for that disease. So those double downs, if you would, or pile-ons become particularly different or difficult. The numbers are not good and are even worse in rare diseases. So if you think about racial and ethnic minority alone, 38% of the population, but only 16% representation in trials, we've got a pretty big gap to fill. Kelly mentioned that COVID had given us, had shined some light on it. My husband says people don't change when they see the light, they change when they feel the heat. And COVID also provided some heat by showing us that particular communities need to be represented because medications may represent a different benefit to some community members over others, that inclusion in trials may have additional barriers, socioeconomic status and others. And last but not least, some rare diseases are disproportionately represented by different racial and ethnic groups. Duchenne muscular dystrophy is a great example with an increased number of Hispanic young men being affected. But you can go down a long list: sarcoidosis, sickle cell, beta thalassemia, some types of lupus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the importance of inclusion in clinical trial is clearly there. I think the heat and the opportunity are also there for us to move forward with things like, and they were mentioned before, but I think I'll underscore, put an exclamation point, changing the way in which we do trials to include remote monitoring, other forms of technology and tools so that patients have access.
Frida, you used to, I mean, there's this term in D.C., I never always worry about terms, but goes around for politically important people. You were a poobah at Pfizer, and you were a poobah frequently on Dr. Phil. So you were in very important spots, and now you're on Steve Clemons' show on the Hill. Let me just ask you, talking about these subjects, in your gut, do you feel like we're moving in the wrong direction? How far do we go? What would you grade the overall health ecosystem on the inclusion front?
I think we're doing better, but we have a ways to go. Some of it is building infrastructure, understanding the barriers better first, right? We make some assumptions about what the barriers are. This is where the patient's voice comes in, where we think the barrier is one thing, and it turns out that you have to ask patients, and it may be a little bit different, and we may have to have a number of solutions. So I think doing better listening, we're doing that and now are coming up with better solutions. One of the pivotal points for me was I was doing a talk on rare diseases, and I kept saying patient engagement and patients are being engaged. And one of the advocates that was on the stage with me touched me on my knee. She said, honey, we've been engaged for a long time. It's time to be married. And I think that we are married now.
That's cool.
And organizations are partnering in tremendous ways. So we have the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences that has an entire spectrum of partnering work to help teach and connect to get some of the work done. I could go on and on with a list of advancements for individual organizations and broad partnerships that are moving forward to address this. So I would say that I'm optimistic that we're moving down the road, but we got a little bit of ways to go still.
Look, this is a fantastic conversation. Look, we're almost out of time, but I just feel like, I'm often with members of Congress, both parties, Democrats, Republicans, hanging out, members of the administration, cabinet members, policy players. I would like to ask each of you, if you were to kind of give me a little one tidbit to share in that audience when I get the opportunity about this front, give me something to push. Dr. McCormick?
Just that these genetic rare lung diseases, rare diseases of all types, have tremendous potential for advancement and early discovery because the clues are so rich. And it's a great investment. You can affect a lot of people in a short period of time in a very dramatic way. So I think it's very important for Congress to focus on these rare illnesses that we have the potential to cure.
What a great suggestion, and I will do my best with that. Kelly Maynard?
Support Cures 2.0, support the STAT Act. And as Dr. Frida mentioned, we've come a long way. We're witnessing a watershed moment with medical innovation right now. But that innovation means absolutely nothing if we can't get those treatments to every single patient that is eligible to receive them. And so innovation can't stop at approval. We have to keep going. We have to improve payer engagement. We have too many people speaking on the burden of disease that aren't rare disease patients. That should never happen. The only thing worse than having no treatment approved for a disease as a patient or as a parent is having a drug approved and not being able to get access to it. So that would be the next push that we really need to fight for as patients.
Terrific. And Frida Lewis Hall. Frida?
I have to do a little bit of pile on with Kelly to say, so having Star Wars medicine, but a Flintstones access does not work. I think we have tremendous explosive work.
Frida, I have to interrupt.
And we need to make sure to get it there.
I have to interrupt. Did you just say having a Star Wars medicine with Flintstones access? I just love both.
Yes.
Okay, great.
I'm going to steal that, Dr. Frida. I'm going to steal that.
I mean, that's called a tweetable moment, folks. I mean,
so we need Star Wars access.
In case our team is watching this and writing about this today, that is definitely a line. Anyway, please finish because I just had to make sure I had that right. Go ahead, Frida.
No, I think it's very important for us to continue to spawn the kinds of partnerships and infrastructure that allows us to move things forward faster.
Well, listen, I want to thank you. What a wonderful, I think, impactful and consequential conversation. Dr. Frank McCormick, a professor of internal medicine at the University of Cincinnati School of Medicine, Kelly Maynard, founder of the Little Hercules Foundation, and Dr. Frida Lewis Hall, the former chief medical officer at Pfizer and a patient health advocate. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Patients with rare diseases offer a compelling portrait of their condition, and understanding their experience, their lived experience, can play a big role in advancing therapies. Joining me now for a first-person account is Sarah Bacon. Sarah was diagnosed with Lamb disease in 2013. This is a rare lung disease that mostly affects women of childbearing age. Sarah's a patient advocate, and a writer. Sarah, I really appreciate you talking with us. And I have learned a lot about rare diseases in the last couple of years because we've done various programs there. And I don't think most of America realizes that 1 in 10 Americans have some form of rare disease. But each community of rare diseases, of which there are more than 7,000, can be a very small community. So can you tell us about your experience as a rare disease patient? Have you built community? What are the pieces of this scaffolding that we need to understand better?
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me. So social media has been a game changer for every single rare disease patient. Before, we used to really live in isolation. It was really hard to find your community. And that community is scattered across the world for LAM. LAM is short for lymphangioliomyomatosis, LAM for short. There are approximately 1,500 women in the US with LAM. That is a probability of being struck by lightning, as the same probability as being struck by lightning or killed by a tornado as being diagnosed by LAM, 1 in 2 million with LAM, excuse me. And across the world, there are approximately 250,000 of us. So imagine what it was like before we had social media to find our sisters in disease. For me, one of the first things I did in 2013 when I was formally diagnosed was to go online and see who was talking about this disease. And pretty soon, I found a patient advocacy group called the LAM Foundation and a second one called the LAM Health Alliance. Now, having 2 patient advocacy groups for my disease was also a stroke of luck, because so many rare diseases are so small that they don't have institutions advocating for them. But with LAM, there was a woman in the 1990s who founded the LAM Foundation in honor of her daughter who had been diagnosed with LAM. And they had already raised $19 million to fund research. So I found a lot of comfort in the guidance they gave me and this other patient advocacy group, which is not a luxury that most rare disease patients have either.
Well, one of the things I've learned from talking to both men and women with rare diseases is how powerful they can be as agents, that they take hold of the situation. They interact with the FDA, they interact with the pharmaceutical companies, and play a role in building support for clinical trials and whatnot. I guess my question is, in your experience as you've looked at things, as one of the topics we're discussing today, are there structural enhancements one can make at something like the FDA with experts or rare disease advisory committees, or pieces of this therapy puzzle, if you will, that you have insights into that we could talk about?
Yes, well, there are some groups that exist. As part of the Affordable Care Act, President Obama instituted something called PCORI, which is the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which was designed to bring in experts from the fields, practitioners, patients, consultants on advisory panels to help allocate funding for rare disease and larger medical research, so not just rare disease. I, for example, serve on the rare disease panel at PCORI, and we are a group of about 20 people. We're on 3-year terms, and we regularly look at a potential portfolio of grants. And the goal of this Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute was to really bring patients into the conversation, which had been led for so long by pharmaceutical companies, biotech, the FDA. And yet it's the patients who are the ones who are living day to day with progressive diseases, suffering, caretaking, and who know what these treatments, if we're lucky enough to have a treatment in the rare disease space, only 5% of rare diseases have treatments, let alone cures. But we're the ones who feel how those treatments affect our lives. So there's that. The NIH about 10 years ago started a program called NCATS, which was also dedicated to looking at ways in which research for one disease, say LAM, could translate to potential findings and research for other diseases. So, for example, my clinician, who also runs a lab at Columbia University, it's called the LAM Lab, determined that there are biomarkers for LAM and colon cancer and melanoma in LAM cells. So that could translate, that finding could translate to potential treatments down the road for both colon cancer and melanoma through a LAM research lab. And this is an issue that is potentially of great proportions for broader patient populations that the NIH and others have been focusing on, this translational impact. What does it mean if you find a shared biomarker between LAM and other diseases with much larger patient populations?
It sounds to me like a remarkable development because it changes, I assume, I hate to put it down to this, but it changes the economics of it as well, right? It changes, the incentives to continue to go on, because there is a financial and investment dimension to this. And as I look at the challenge in rare diseases, the problem is that each vertical, if you will, of people who are suffering may be smaller than the NIH or corporate pharmaceuticals are interested in doing. I just be interested in your insights into what we might do to think about moderating. Is there a public policy need to step into these places where the economics aren't right?
Well, there has been legislation in the past. For example, in 1983, the Orphan Drug Act, which basically gave tax breaks for R&D to pharmaceutical companies to incentivize them to invest in disease groups with smaller patient populations, which of course aren't going to be as profitable for them down the line. That was huge step forward in promoting research for now over 7,300 rare diseases, which got very little funding. I mean, for many years, and still, the NIH is the world's largest funder of rare disease research. The world over. My doctor, who again runs a lab, has done all of her LAM research. I'd say 95% of her LAM research has been funded by consecutive LAM grants, NIH grants over the last 20 years or so. So there still is a real deficit of funding for that early stage research in the lab. And if there were further legislation to incentivize groups, whether biotech, big pharma, foundations, the federal government, whoever they may be, to invest in that early stage research, then we could find out so much more about that translational impact I was talking about, because it's
Right.
getting the research off the ground. You have a proof of concept, and then you can apply for more NIH grants. But that's not going to do it all. When I was diagnosed, my very first evaluation with my doctor, she was asking me about my medical history. And I said, well, melanoma killed my father, and I have had melanoma. And she paused and she said, well, Lamb cells and melanoma cells share biomarkers. And I said, well, what do you know about this? This was in 2013. And she said, nothing more than that. No one's researched it. And I said, so there are 80 dedicated Lamb researchers around the world. That was in 2013. You guys know this, and no one's funded research around it? How much would that cost? And I was thinking 6 figures, maybe 7 figures, having no prior background in biomedical research. She said, well, for 15 grand, I could design a study of women with Lamb who have melanoma histories and get a proof of concept. And with that proof of concept, I could apply for more money to study it further and do a clinical trial. I thought 15 grand, that's a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of things for medical research, it was nothing. So I raised it, and she designed the study, and she had meaningful findings. It's that type of strategic funding and philanthropy, if you will, but strategic funding at the early stage level that can really lead to really meaningful discoveries.
It's a totally powerful example. I'm really grateful for you sharing that. Let me just ask you finally, Sarah, I imagine people are going to be watching this show today on World Rare Disease Day, but also looking at it down the road as someone in the future finds out they fit into one of these categories. I know this is sort of an unfair question, but for that person out there who's just all of a sudden hit with a realization that they're in a small community, that they may not have automatic on-ramps to therapies and cures, I'd be interested in what advice you'd give that individual.
Well, look, first of all, that shock of diagnosis with a progressive disease is like hitting hit by a bolt of lightning. So I would advise, first and foremost, pause, take a deep breath, and turn online to find community. There is community out there for every rare disease, and know that you are your best advocate. I really became a hospitalist in a way, in that you're the one, you have to ask your doctors the tough questions. You have to get second and third opinions. You have to challenge the status quo, challenge the paradigms, because some diseases are so rare that the doctors who you inherently trust might not know where to look either. So you become a team. You've got to, if you can't do it yourself, because you're not feeling well enough, you've got to build a team of people who can help your family, dear friends, who can help you navigate for answers, because no one's going to do it for you.
Listen, folks, this is very valuable insights from someone who has lived experience in this space. I want to thank Sarah Bacon, who's a patient. She's a patient advocate and a writer. Thank you so much for sharing part of your journey and experience with us.
My pleasure, Steve. Thank you.
My final guest on today's program is Congressman Brett Guthrie, a Republican from Kentucky and a member of the Rare Disease Congressional Caucus. He's also the ranking member of the Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee. I spoke to Congressman Guthrie just a short while ago. Take a listen.
Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. When this airs, because this conversation is happening a little bit before on February 28th, it's going to be Rare Diseases Day in America. And, it's, I think, bringing a lot of eyeballs to this important subject that 1 in 10 Americans, may suffer from a rare disease. And there are about 7,000 of them. And so they don't necessarily lend themselves to the scale of research and response that other diseases do. And I know that this is an issue you care about. What are the missing pieces that you think we need to fix in our equation of being more responsive to those Americans that have rare disease challenges.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. And it is important. And the one thing is, I have a lady that from my district, Kayla Booth, who came and talked about being the fourth generation with Huntington's disease. And until she came to speak before Congress, I'm not sure I knew what Huntington's disease was. I'd heard of it and did my research just to understand her. And so advocates coming to the Hill is important. I think when they promote cures for the diseases that they have, it makes it we put a face and a name instead of looking at numbers. And so I think that's important. You know, the big thing is just trying to push innovation, particularly in the rare diseases, and where we can fit in, like the orphan drug program, the tax incentives for people to do research, because you know, everybody would love to come up with a cure for Alzheimer's someday, anything with diabetes, because so many people have it. When you talk about rare diseases, I think Congress has to incentivize the private sector to move forward, and like with orphan drugs. There's an interesting thing that's been negotiated in the user fee agreements. I have to look at the Rare Disease Endpoint Advancement Program. That's a big word for a non-healthcare professional. But where they try to pick novel cures or novel advancements to certain endpoints, or not necessarily cures, but endpoints where they can measure success in rare diseases and hopefully be applicable to broader ones. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about that negotiation as we address these user fees in Congress.
You know, and I think another dimension that has come up a lot as I've kind of, you know, done research in this area is concern that the FDA's role oversight, of course, looking at, you know, drugs that are developed and, you know, brought online to cure Americans, but also the safety of Americans and people in general all over the world, you know, that both of these equities are, you know, being taken care of together, but that in the rare disease area, we may not have as much infrastructure of expertise and knowledge on rare diseases within, you know, the analysis, within the kind of community reviews, within expert reviews, and wondering whether or not you think, given the fact that there's going to be new leadership at the FDA, Robert Califf, who's just been confirmed, whether or not this is an opportunity to see some structural changes and some smartening up of the infrastructure at the FDA when it comes to rare diseases.
Well, yeah, you know, the FDA should be the most esprit de corps of any agency in government right now. I mean, coming off the Operation Warp Speed of approving the vaccines, proving that they can be approved safe and effective in a timely manner is what we need to capture that and move forward with that. You know, I couldn't really give you a great answer on how the structure of the FDA is going to move forward with the rare diseases, but you're right. The more rare disease, obviously, the less people studying it that are affected by it. I have a constituent with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy with his son. That's a kind of a rare version of that. And just trying to get studies moving and finding people to participate in studies is difficult to do. But, you know, I'm looking forward to what the user fee agreements come out with, what we want to try to promote with drug pricing and so forth, and try to incentivize these kind of cures to come forward.
You know, coming back to the FDA debate, and I know it's not, I'll tell our audience, it's not your role to confirm presidential nominees. But when Robert Califf came up, I watched the debate pretty closely, and you had, you know, Bernie Sanders and Ed Markey and Joe Manchin on the same page opposing Robert Califf, probably the only thing they all agree on. And then you had 6 Republican senators, Roy Blunt and some others, that came out and supported. So, you know, they crossed over, and then he was able to squeak by, but very, very close confirmation. And as I think about the debate was a little bit about the era of opioids and the opioid approvals and the fact that one of the criticisms is that the leadership of the FDA hasn't yet shown how it wouldn't repeat that kind of crisis. Now, I'm not going to say that critique is right or not, but it raises a kind of interesting foil between the pressure to try to approve more, approve faster, but also not fall back into what we saw with opioids. Is this something that you and your colleagues in the health world take seriously as well? I mean, I know that your role is not Califf in the FDA, but
absolutely. There were other names that were mentioned for that position that the past history and the opioid approvals didn't go forward, that I thought would have been good choices as well. It's interesting when you see a bipartisan confirmation somewhere where well, if you have Joe Manchin and Bernie Sanders, you're not really with the extremes, but it is a bipartisan confirmation. Probably means we had the right person. Certainly, there's a big history of what happened with opioids. I've read everything I can on it. Now we have illicit fentanyl that's coming across our border, and we do have to be mindful of it. And we have to be mindful as members of Congress. We see people from our districts like Kayla Booth that I talked about. I can tell you, Mitch Enzer, who just passed away not too long ago of ALS, that let's get cures out. We want it to move forward, and we have to respect the science. We have to respect it. Not only do they have to find an efficacy that it works, we also have to make sure that it's safe and doesn't cause other issues. But, we have things like right to try this move forward, and like you wouldn't want something to cure an allergy that could ruin your liver. But if you're stage 4 cancer and there's something out there that say, this could ruin your liver, but you have stage 4 cancer, there's some risk to take there. And so we need to make sure the risk and reward is balanced. And you're right, we just need to make sure as members of Congress, we're not, and I don't think the FDA just reacts to us on things such as that, but we want our constituents to get the cures that they need. And they often come to us and say, there's this study and it's out there, and my son may not walk again if he doesn't have access to it sooner rather than later. And so we do get those emotions and push, and the FDA has to be structured where they make sure the science is the science. But if people are not going to walk again, or they're at their deathbed, or at the end of their life, or could be at the end of their life, and there's some hope, they don't need to block that as well.
Yeah, I think that there are things like the Orphan Drug Act. I know there's the Speeding Therapy Access Today Act. There are these number of acts that are trying to create, I would say, a more stable pathway for the rare drug sector. And I think it's complicated. I spent a lot of time looking at this. The economics of it are really complicated, because when you have a need for a small class of individuals, and that's defined at a certain level, you're not going to necessarily get the same economics of scale that
how do you make it affordable? How do you make it where businesses want to produce it? And how do you make it affordable? And things like the Orphan Drug Act and moves forward. The one thing that we don't need to do is get with a drug price. Or out there's a dictating the price of drugs as part of the Build Better Act. And we've seen CBO, we've seen other studies say this is going to hurt innovation. So that's, and people will say, well, that's just a handful of drugs and it's probably the broadest use. But that money does fund these other orphan drugs, or these other rare disease drugs. And what's interesting when you start talking to a lot of drug producers, not just always the big guy, but stuff you see coming out of universities that spin off to research and private sector. There are people that spend their life studying just specific drugs in the hopes of someday having a cure for that. And so what we need to do is make it affordable to the patient, because it's going to be expensive for them to move forward. And the one thing Kurt Schrader and I from Oregon have really worked on, and Mark Wayne Mullen from Oklahoma, with the value-based agreements, that I've had somebody come to me that says that I've met with different people that have cures or not necessarily cures, but hemophilia that can really change the course of a hemophiliac. And they says, this will save money over the long term. And we're willing to risk it. If they use our therapy, which is expensive, they don't get the results, the Medicaid program of a state or a health insurance company of whoever is being treated, if they don't get the rewards, then we'll share in it. But and I think that really plays in Medicaid well. A lot of states don't want to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars for one treatment, but if they can get the savings over the course of someone's life, we need to do it anyway, because the person needs the treatment, right? So, we accept that we need to get the treatment to them, but there are a lot of programs that really get affected by really expensive treatments. But if the manufacturer shares in the risk, and if you don't get the reward financially, the system that we say you're going to get, and the reason you wouldn't, because the patient doesn't get the cure they say they're going to get, we can cure sickle cell anemia now. And just think of what that does to a person's life. And so we just need to have the systems in place to pay for that.
This can sound wonky, folks, but I am really interested in what comes after Build Back Better. If Build Back Better is dead, and Senator Manchin says that he wants everything to go through what's called regular order, which means going back to committees. And, Senator Manchin I've interviewed says, our legislation will be better and more informed if we approach it in a bipartisan way, if we give our colleagues across the aisle an opportunity to weigh in and that in the end, no matter whether they voted or not, you're going to have a better package. In your role as the ranking Republican on the Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee, do you expect some of these pieces of Build Back Better are going to break off and then come back into your committee and proceed and get the benefit of your and your colleagues' views and amendments on that legislation in regular order?
Well, we would love to see what we call HR 19, so you have HR 3, which we say dictates price to drug manufacturers, which I think if you don't agree to the price, you lose 95% of your revenue, you're probably going to have to accept that price. So that's what HR 3 does. We have HR 19, which has, I think, close to 40 provisions that are bipartisan. So if they came back and said, hey, why don't we move on HR 19? It does things like these drug companies need exclusivity in order to promote and have a reward, so they'll invest. But we don't want them to game exclusivity, so where generics can come into the marketplace quicker. I mean, there are 40, I think it's 40 provisions. I looked at it just recently, but some number of provisions that have a Democrat and a Republican co-sponsor. And if we don't come back and do it in the summertime, if Build Back Better doesn't move forward, and have the fortune to be chair of the ranking subcommittee, if things go our way in the fall, I will tell you, I'm going to push to bring HR 19 or some version of it to the floor, a bipartisan drug bill, pharmaceutical pricing bill that will have big impacts on what people pay. And another big part of making affordable is for our seniors, Medicare Part D, we could do that. Medicare Part D reform, there's no out-of-pocket caps in Medicare Part D, which most insurance plans have. And that would be every American over the age of 65 would see that. Now that we need to make sure it's affordable for the taxpayer to pay for, but just the out-of-pocket expenses for seniors, that would just be phenomenal, I think. And that's something I think you would get every member of the committee to vote for moving forward if they would just bring that up without being part of a bigger bill that has things that we don't support.
And let me just ask you finally, you've been out applauding, and you were part of the 21st Century Cures Act. You supported that. You applauded the work of your Republican colleague, Fred Upton, and Democrat Diana Gett in leading on it. I've talked to both of them about it. It's basically science, applied. Let's solve problems. Let's kind of, begin moving. And so part of that is on the science side of it. The other side, we're discussing a little bit today is FDA reform. But I want to know from you whether or not there's another set of versions of those things that are out there. Like, is there more room for bipartisan, let's work and get problems fixed in this, research and drug development area, or is it as toxic and as divided politically as the papers are saying?
No, I think there's room to work. And so the point for HR 19, for example, as I just described, has a Republican, I think every provision,
right,
and we did it that way, has a Republican and Democrat co-sponsor, and we can move that forward. What the problem you get into, if you don't want to go down that path, and what we'll have to watch if we're in control, and they certainly did it with HR 3, is put in provisions that aren't bipartisan and just bring that kind of partisan divide. And so if we have the opportunity to have control next time around, I think that HR 19, and what we need to do is say, we need to put forth things that we can have agreement on. And if we can't get an agreement on it, then we don't move forward. Now, I don't want people to come back and retract because we already have agreement on what's in HR 19 as well. And maybe there are other things we can have an agreement on moving forward. But the problem with a lot of bills that seem to pass out of the House, we're about 95% bipartisan. And it's that last handful of things that they try to put in at the end, or they have the ability to do, that keeps it from moving forward bipartisan. But I don't think it's just toxic just in nature. And there are some things that we just can't agree on.
Yeah.
But there are things that we can agree on, and if we just focus on that. So if the Energy and Commerce Committee came back and said, hey, we're not going to be able to move HR 3, so we're going to do the Medicare Part D reform standalone, or some version of HR 19 with just provisions that both sides agree on, I think we would have one of the best hearings and markups you've seen in Congress in a long time.
I love that the name of your constituent that brought you to the rare disease area. It's always nice to hear that you actually know your people and know their issues. Tell us her name again.
Well, Kayla Booth is the one that had the Huntington's disease, and she's young, and hopefully we're going to have some of these rare disease cures to help her as we move forward. The other name I mentioned was, unfortunately, I've been to his funeral. It is Mitch Enzer, and I didn't know them before. Matter of fact, I didn't meet him until I went to his house. His wife and daughter came to DC to advocate for ALS research and invited me to come meet him. And I said, well, I'm going to do it. So we went and became friends with the family and didn't know them before until they came for a visit to Washington. And I think those stories are more common than people think. People always talk about all the lobbyists in DC. I'll say the most important lobbyist in Washington, DC is when a constituent shows up from home. And that's how we feel about it. And I think that's how most of my colleagues, if not all, feel about it. And unfortunately, I've been to Mitch's funeral, but that's how you really get to know people. And his wife says, his daughter came into my office. She's 23 now, but she was 12 when she came and said that I know that this is probably not a cure that's going to help my father. My father can't hug me anymore, is what she said. But I want a little girl. I don't want a little girl to go through what I'm going through. And so you talking about an effective lobbyist when a 10, I guess she was 12 at the time, comes and tells you that in your office, that gets you fired up to get on the Energy and Commerce Committee and try to look for these cures.
Well, it's so powerful, and it's really, really terrific that we can, talk about real people as we're discussing these other heady issues about FDA reform and whatnot. Congressman Brett Guthrie,
well, you got to remember FDA reform is about real people. That's what I want to remind you. Exactly.
So Congressman Brett Guthrie of Kentucky, ranking Republican on the Energy and Commerce Committee's Health Subcommittee, always answers our call to have these smart discussions at the Hill. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having us here. Hopefully we'll do these in person someday soon.
I look forward to that.
Me too.
Many thanks to Congressman Brett Guthrie, a Republican from Kentucky. Thank you, Brett. That brings us to the end of our program today. A very big thank you to Alexian Pharmaceuticals for its support of these conversations and all of you attendees for joining us today. If you missed any of this, we're going to have the video up from the event on our website shortly. I'm Steve Clemens. Thank you, and be well.